Hi, Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. There's a book that's been out about 3 years now called Apatheism by Kyle Beshears, subtitled How We Share When They Don't Care. And what's interesting to me is I've picked up this book because I'm hearing other authors talking about it. They're referencing it in many cases when they're talking about this world of apathy that's out there. Let me just share, first of all, just what some people have said about the book. I'm looking at the back cover. Daniel Darling, he's a senior vice president of communications for National Religious Broadcasters, and he's a pastor. He said, "This is a book you need to reach a world that doesn't seem to care. With painstaking scriptural focus and a heart full of compassion for the lost, Beshears lays out an approach that's both biblical and wise. If you care about the people who don't care, you need this book." A director of the Gospel Coalition also gives it a thumbs up. Vice President for Doctoral Studies and the Chair for the Department of Apologetics at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, says that Beshears provides a clear roadmap for sharing the gospel for those people that claim they're not interested in whether the claims of Jesus are true. So I thought maybe I'd give you part of his intro, maybe some of chapter 1. We'll see what the time is like. And he said, which I understand completely, he said, when you think about obstacles to evangelism, he says, you don't normally think of apathy. He says, what you think of are challenges coming from other religious beliefs like Islam or Buddhism, or maybe a-religious beliefs like atheism and agnosticism. And it says, you can get in those kinds of arguments all the time. And with those people, but it's hard to get into an argument with somebody who's apathetic. He says the apathy that we see today, he said, seems very odd when you consider what the past was like, because a long time ago, nearly everybody cared about God, or at least some kind of supernatural being. And of course, he references Paul's interesting story there in Acts 17 when he goes to Athens and says, hey, I noticed you have monuments to the unknown God. And he says, I'm here to pronounce who that God is. So he said, well, our problem is today we're living in Athens, but there's no statue to an unknown God. So notice Paul would come to our culture and say, wait, where do I start here with the people that don't care at all? So Beshears, in the next section, this is still in his intro, says that we have a job as Christians. We're supposed to understand our culture so well that they will understand what we're talking about. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly it. We're supposed to be ambassadors. What's an ambassador? Well, ambassador not only knows his own background, his own culture, his own country, its history, but he's supposed to know something about the place that he's going to so he can interact effectively. So I think that's really important. Beshears points out, of course, it's God who saves people. Yes, amen to that. When I speak to groups, I often try to bring that up to say the pressure's not on us. All we're supposed to do is be faithful and present the message, and then it's up to God to actually do the savings. That takes a tremendous burden off of us. Beshears says God saves people through saved people, and they herald the good news of his kingdom. He says, but trouble is we got deafening agents, he says, out there that stop the ears of the people that God would like to call to himself. So he says atheism believes God doesn't exist. We have agnosticism that believes we can't know whether God exists or not. And we have apatheism that believes God exists is irrelevant. It says we shouldn't care about him at all. Wow, that's a really hard nut to crack to figure out how in the world you interact with that. He says, why are we this way? And he's going to explore that later in future chapters, but he just introduces this term, this dispassion, he calls it, toward God. He said, we have a society that's secular, comfortable, and distracted. And so he explores that briefly here, and like I said, he'll do more with it later on. So when he uses secularism, it's not just the absence of religious belief. It's just that believing in God seems difficult to hold, and it's just one choice among a whole lot of other options, and so it's disputable. So that's what he means by secularism. What does he mean by comfortable society that we're in? Well, it's a sense that we're safe and there's tranquility and we're in a prosperous society and we're cushioned from all sorts of terrible things, which is true. There's nothing false about that. And then the third thing, he says we're distracted these days. Well, that's pretty obvious. Our digital age gives us so much to do that it relieves us from thinking about things that are actually important. Yeah, it's pretty sad, but I think we see that around us all the time. So that's his opener. As he ends the beginning chapter, he says and I think this is so powerful to think of, what's our mission? He says we're commissioned by our King to proclaim his good news everywhere, even in an age of apathy. So what do? We're supposed to pierce through our neighbors' indifference to awaken their souls. Why? Because we want to present to them an abundant source of eternal joy. And I like the fact that he says this is not going to be easy work. But he said the joy that comes from this labor makes any other work pale by comparison. So I think that's true. Okay, so chapter 1. Cultural conditions of apatheism. So he starts off and he said, people in medieval Europe, for example, lived in an enchanted world. They thought there was a God. He was separate. He was transcendent. He was above his creation. But also he was immanent. He was near. He was active. And the universe was filled with natural and supernatural beings that shared spaces. Farmers and spirits and blacksmiths and devils and kings and angels. And that boundary between the natural world that we all experienced back then and the spiritual realm, that was a thin boundary and it was often crossed. So people felt vulnerable to spiritual powers, whether they were good or evil. He says, now fast forward 5 centuries. Belief in God isn't your default position, it's optional. And for a lot of people, it's unnecessary to believe in God. They just dismiss the whole idea of God. He says apatheism flourishes in a society where belief in God, and these are key points here, our society today said we have belief in God is contestable. And he'll explain that in just a second. It's contestable and diverse. And the people are comfortable and distracted. So people are trying to pursue fulfillment without God because he's considered irrelevant. It has nothing to do with our origin, our meaning, or our joy. He says we live in an affluent society. It tends to all our wants. It tends to all our needs. It entertains us. It amuses us. So he says we live comfortably and distracted, and that keeps us from contemplating the biggest questions of life. And he mentions another book that I'm going to get to. I just read that one, and it's called Disruptive Witness. And that also talks about secularism and technology and prescribes ways for us to get beyond this distracted age for the sake of the gospel. So that's another book that you might think about reading, Disruptive Witness. And it's so funny because that book references this book, Apatheism, and here Beshears references that book. So they both like each other a lot, and I'm hearing other authors talking about both of them. So he moves to the idea of secularism. Remember what he said before. He said we think of it as skepticism, that it's people that don't believe anything. He said we assume that skepticism leads to indifference about God. He said, but that's not always the case. He said skepticism doesn't represent everything about secularism. He said, imagine secularism as a state in which it's okay either to disbelieve in God or to believe differently than your neighbors, whether that belief has to do with God or gods or nothing at all. And it didn't used to be that way. So 500 years ago, belief in God was unchallenged. Everybody got that. Everybody thought that made sense. But he said, now, we've got secularism in this society today, and it leads to apatheism. Why? He said, well, first, secularism gives us an alternate explanation for how the universe came about and the meaning of life. You don't have to appeal to a supernatural. So people say, all right, well then, why make a big deal about God? And then the second reason that secularism can lead to apatheism, it provides all sorts of pluralism, all these different beliefs out there. So it kind of robs people of a reason to care about God. There's so many competing truth claims. How would you know? And people just kind of shut down and say, forget it. And he said, In both instances, with this skepticism and this pluralism, people lose reason to care about God. Either they don't think he's needed to answer some of the big questions of life, or there's just too many answers to those questions. I mean, think about the people just in your community, in my community. How many different beliefs do they have just on a local level? And think about it around the world. It's crazy. So people today just kind of shut down. They just relax, and they just let the religious thinkers and the philosophers deal with it. They don't want to deal with it. So he takes the first issue here, and I'd like to explore that for just a few minutes. Secularism leads to skepticism. He said, go back to the Enlightenment. What happened at that time? Remember, he's talked about the medieval time period. So then we get the Enlightenment. And he said it produced, the ideas at least, produced the idea of a universe that didn't have a God. Philosophy was considered without God. Government was without God. Science and reason really cast an unflattering light on enchanted beliefs. So before the Enlightenment, the existence of God was just basically unquestionable. And afterwards, belief seemed kind of like it was childish, it was silly. The world became disenchanted. They said, some people still cared, they still believed. There was a disconnect between all these Enlightenment thinkers sitting in their ivory towers and the common people. And the common people still believe. They're haunted by a sense that there's got to be something beyond this natural world. Well, then in the 1800s, Darwin came along, and that moved out into the public in general. And Daniel Dennett, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they're called, the new atheist, he's a philosopher, and he said Darwinism acted like a universal acid. What do you mean? It ate through every traditional concept until you had this whole new worldview, and that remained. So he says, what we're being told, our story that people tell us these days, is Western society is a story about subtraction. What does he mean? We've removed God from the equation. Now what's left? Human reason and our desires. That's going to guide us into a new area of modernity. And so for today, for a lot of people, God's irrelevant. Science and skepticism did away with needing him to explain life and how it came about. So God becomes irrelevant these days. Meaning of life isn't found in a religion or a God. It's found where? In us. We have to strive. We've got to push ourselves. We've got to find our own fulfillment. That's where we're going to find joy. We're only here for a short while. Sometime in the future, we're going to turn back to dust. So we've got to make the most of every moment. And really, then they said, of course, religion can be contentious. So why get worked up over that? It's just an imaginary superstition anyway. He references a man, a journalist, Jonathan Rauch, who said that, and actually he came up with the idea of the term apathyism in an Atlantic Monthly article called Let It Be. And he got rid of fundamentalists, right? He was after fundamentalists in that article, whether they were religious, like some of the Muslim people are, or a-religious, like Stalinism. He said that all of those beliefs are harmful to the progression and safety of our society. What do we need, he says? Apatheism. That calms everything. He says if you get a society that's just dispassionate, doesn't really care about these big issues, they get undisturbed by radicalization. And now the author, Beshears, says, Rauch, the prescription now may be reality. A sociologist he references said that in a secular society, religion is seen as a positive force. It can teach moral beliefs and it can offer comfort, but fervent belief, right, in public spaces especially, is frowned on. So Beshears is summing up this section. He says, if secularism means that belief in God is contestable, in other words, we're not sure, then some apatheists lack the reason to care about God. Ideas like naturalism and materialism explain God away, and we don't need him. We look at the world and we say, yeah, it's here, and that's all there is, so why should you care at all? He also says secularism is a diversity of belief. There's some of the problem. He said belief in God is not only contestable, it is, but secularism also means that belief in God is diverse. We got all these forms and all these alternatives to Christianity. And so we don't see in our Western world anymore that God exists and that he exists exclusively in Christian terms. So at one time, it was hard not to believe in God. But today, things have changed so much. Skepticism is not the reigning champion. Really, belief hasn't eroded. It's just simply fractured. He says we have sheltered ourselves from the external world. He calls it a buffered self. So he's going to use that term throughout the book. We're buffered. We become the masters of meaning. We're separated from everything else. So what are we today? We're a rational, material being, and our ultimate purposes are the things that arise within us. In a sense, we have a firewall in our mind, and it blocks any idea or experience that we don't like. And any idea that wants us to do certain things, it's up to us. Meaning is what we make of it, and that's just the way it is. So the center of all of our thoughts today, our beliefs, our feelings, is where? It's in our mind. And you've got to protect your mind from all these external influences, because the most important source of meaning is me. Yeah, do we hear that a lot these days? He says this buffering has a huge impact on belief in God. If we're a buffered self, you're not meaningful because God's given you meaning. The opposite's true now. God is meaningful because I give him meaning. And if individuals are the ones that create meaning, then there are potentially as many beliefs as there are people. So secularism today is not just a religious skepticism, it's religious diversity. So he says, our challenge to belief then is not to say it's under assault by skepticism. He said it is, but that there's so many beliefs to choose from, both religious and a-religious. So he said, take a look. He said, in our ever-shrinking global community, we've got all sorts of options. He said, major world religions, of course, Islam and Buddhism, for example. But we've got newer beliefs, transhumanism and neo-paganism. So I think he's making some really good points there. I think I'll stop at this part of the book. I'm still in his first major chapter. But I wanted to share the opener here because it lays out kind of the foundation for where we are as a society, where we were and where we are today, and this loss of faith and why it's come about the way it has. Because again, if we're going to be ambassadors, we need to know our society. And I think he's done an excellent job here. So he's Kyle Beshears. It's called Apatheism. And what he's trying to do is to urge us to recapture our salvation and our joy in that salvation, and how to display the love of Christ to people who are apathy-oriented. And I see that all over the place. It's hard to get a good conversation going. People are just saying, well, whatever. And we don't want that to be the case. Eternal souls are on the line. So this book is a challenge to all of us. I'll get back to it. We'll do another podcast on that soon. In the meantime, I hope you're having a good day, and thanks for listening.